Hi, everybody. It's Matt again. The last time I did a video, I talked about movies that I like to watch to inspire me for Ars Magica. It got me thinking I should talk a little bit more about Ars Magica. Now, this is one of my all-time favorite tabletop role-playing games. And I say that having only played for, I don't know, a year or so back in the 90s. A couple of different games of it, but over the course of about a year. So, what is Ars Magica? This is a game set in Mythic Europe. Mythic Europe is the Europe that you and I know from medieval history books, but it's a version of it seen through the eyes of the people who lived in it. So magic is real, God is real, the devil is real. These things are there, and they're there to cause trouble for you. But magic is real, and that's sort of one of the most important things about the game, because in this game you play magic users, you play wizards or magi. I know the proper pronunciation doesn't sound that great. Anyway, so you play a wizard. That's what this game is really about. Where a lot of games, the wizard is, especially fantasy games like a D&D, the wizard is a side character, frankly, sometimes not very good. This is a game that's where the focus really lies, is on that concept. And wizards exist as a sort of, almost a sub-government in European life, a secret society that works within the realm of Europe, but it has its own factions. Anyway, that's a long way of getting around it. Ars Magic is a different type of role-playing game for a lot of reasons. It's a game about layers in a lot of ways. There are different layers of how to play the game, different layers of characters, different layers of power and conflict. It's also what's called a troupe-style game, where you're not necessarily, like in a lot of games, you usually will play just one character. You'll be focused on an individual character and, you know, their trials and tribulations. In Ars Magica, you tend to play multiple characters. One might be your core character, your magi, usually, because again, that's really where the game's story tends to be around. But you'll also play what's called companion. It's not a companion for your magi; it's a companion for the group of characters. And this might be any character, any person at all, who is interesting and who you want to put time and effort into. So. Where you have, again, a magi character, so this is central, but then you would have the secondary character that would be something like a knight or a local merchant or a traveling, entertainer or something like that. And that character is going to be as fully developed and as fleshed out as a character in any other role-playing game you might play. If you, in fact, removed all of the magic and the magi from this, you could play that character as a normal RPG character and have plenty of interesting things to do with them. So they should be a very interesting, dynamic character. And then you have this third level of play, what are called grogs. And these are peasants, a lot of times hired fighters, hired goons. They don't have a great deal of depth typically. They are not necessarily good for much more than taking a hit for a wizard, but they can be fun to play all by themselves. They can be a ton of fun, but they tend to be of much lesser import. And you might play 2 or 3 of them in a given night without putting an awful lot of effort into it. And you might not even pick up those same characters the next time somebody else might play those 2 or 3 characters. It's not important. They're almost background. They're red shirts from Star Trek. They're there to take the bullet. Again, that said, they can be a ton of fun, but they're not core. So the game itself, again, it's in depth, and I, as a game master in various role-playing games, as a player, I tend to be more interested in what we call system light or whatever you want to call it, but games with a very simple mechanic where the mechanic really gets out of the way, where the game isn't about the mechanics. I like that. I like games like Over the Edge or Everway is one I really like from way back. Games where the mechanics are really easy and simple. That's my general way of doing tabletop role-playing games. Ars Magica is not that. It's almost as far away from that as it can get. It is a complex game, much more complex than I normally like. However, it's so good. And the 5th edition really got it right. This is a game that when I first played it, we were playing with this hodgepodge, MacGyvered together version of the first 3 editions. Pieces of this, pieces of that, woven together the best way we could. Thank goodness several of the players were really familiar with the game and kept it all smooth and kept it running. The guy running the game, he was the core game master for it. He really kept it together. It was great. It was great, but it was rough. It was tough. And as somebody who was like thinking about running the game myself, I couldn't do it. It was too much. 4th edition came out. It didn't really help. I think it actually made things worse. I don't remember a lot of the details, but I remember when we played 4th edition, which I have here, all I really remember from this was the combat, which wasn't necessarily a major part of the game, but the combat I just remember being terrible. It made no sense. 5th edition came out many years ago now, after, unfortunately, I was playing regularly, and I sat down and I read this, and for the first time, I read it and I was like, I could run the game out of this book. Finally, the rules are put together in a way that makes sense, and again, it's complicated. There's a lot to it, but this is presented in a way that I find much more readable, much more understandable, easy to reference. If you've got a problem, you can just go in and look at that section and it will tell you what you need to know. It's great. So the 5th edition, I highly recommend. If you've ever thought about the game and you've seen other editions and you haven't tried it yet, forget it. Just get the 5th edition rules. They're so much easier. Now again, when I talk about this game and why it's interesting to me, there's a lot of reasons. I love the idea of Mythic Europe. I love that you can take Mythic Europe and modify it to what fits your interests best. So you could run a very realistic and historic campaign where the magic is all in the background. It's all quiet and whispered, and that's great. That's fine. But you could also run this as a very mystical, high fantasy strangeness, getting really into that Brothers Grimm vibe where every tree hides a fairy and every shadow could be a demon. Wherever you're looking, there's darkness and magic and strangeness around. In the 3rd edition, I think they really tried to get into those. It was White Wolf, I believe, was putting it out, and it tried to get into the idea of the magic is going away because it was the 90s, and White Wolf, they were all about, the things are fading and things are dying, and anything that's good is dying on the vine. Thank goodness it got kind of away from that. I would not run a game like that. I hate the idea that the magic is dying. The magic is there, and it's fun, and it's exciting, and that's why I want to play it. I don't want to sit there and watch it dissipate. It's not my cup of tea. Anyhow, why is this complicated, though? It's complicated because it really gets into all of these different aspects of magic that you might think about. You can create spells, you can create magic items. There's rules for those things. You can do different types of magic in this game. So when you see wizards in movies or in books, and sometimes they cast a spell and they do something, well, that's in here. It's called formulaic magic. It's a spell. Somebody has figured out how to do a certain thing, and you can, as a character, you can read that, you can learn how to do it, and then you can do that in the game. But then there's also spontaneous magic. That's when you want to do something, but then nobody's written down a spell. But you have command as a character in this. You have command of various elements of magic, and you can try to figure out how to do that yourself, whatever effect you want to create. And then there's formulaic stuff. That's like the big crazy things that you see, like some of the later Harry Potter movies where they're doing these massive things where they have all these different moving pieces. You can do that kind of thing too, and they're really powerful. And I like those different things that you can do. You can also get a familiar, you know, like an animal companion. You can get an apprentice, somebody who you're training. And part of this game is it runs on for a long time. So you could be playing a game that takes place over years, and your magi gets older and wiser and more powerful, but eventually they're going to die. And so you want to get an apprentice so you can train them so that they can take over, and you as the player might take over your apprentice, or another player in your group takes over your apprentice and you take over somebody else's. It depends on what you want to do. Now, with this, there are different types of wizards. There are what they call these houses, the Houses of Hermes, which I have a book here from one of the previous editions, Houses of Hermes. There's several houses. Each one of them has a sort of a different personality. They're almost like a political faction or a philosophical faction. And so you could choose characters from these various ones. Some of them are typically more into struggle and combat and like dueling and that sort of thing, where others are into mystical expressions of magic and trying to learn the secrets of the universe. There's one group, the Bjornir, who are they're originally sort of more Norse, and they're shape changers, and they actually have like a natural inborn ability to become an animal that's connected to their essence of who they are. So there's all sorts of different personalities that you can get into. And then once you figure out what your personality is and you want to start getting into doing the actual magic, you have the system of magic that is so, like, once you learn it, it's so intuitive, it's fantastic. And it involves having basically a verb and a noun. And it's all in Latin because this is the Middle Ages, and this is, you're talking about educated people, so everything's in Latin. But you would have a verb, so like create is creo, I create, and then you would have a noun. And there are several of these verbs and several nouns. So I create ignum, creo ignum, I create fire. And so you would take the magic of creation, the magic of fire, and you combine them together and create fire. And then you know, and in the system, you roll on a certain type of dice, and you succeed or you fail, or you succeed really, really well and it's really impressive, or you fail terribly and things go horribly awry. And that's a lot of fun. So anyhow, it's complicated. It is. I'm not going to lie. But once you get going, it can be really rewarding and really fun and really exciting. And this is one of those few games that has a lot of game mechanics to it that I still really like to play. I still enjoy playing it. And it's a game that I think takes investment and takes buy-in in a way that doesn't necessarily happen with every game. You know, sometimes you can, I don't necessarily recommend this, I don't think this is a great way to play, but you know, you can show up on Friday night for your game night and just sit down and play your character, and then you walk out and you're done. Now, that's fine. It's not great. Honestly, whoever's running your game is not going to necessarily love you as a player, because you know, part of running a game is you hope for players to be more invested in it than just showing up and being talked at for an hour or 2 hours, whatever it is. But with Ars Magica, you kind of need, as a player, you need to commit. You need to get into it. You need to learn the rules. You need to learn how things work, and you need to be proactive. You need to tell your game master, your whatever it is in this game, I can't remember the title, but you need to tell your game master what you want to do, and be invested in what you're doing. Have plans outside of showing up for the session. Your characters, you're not going to get a lot out of your character if your character isn't making plans 5, 10, 15 game years ahead. Now that might be 5, 10 game years, might be 6 or 8 months of actual sessions. because each session a lot of times takes place over what they call a season. It's part of a year. You might have a game that meets in the fall of 1066, and then your next session might not be until the winter of 1070. So it can be over a long period of time. You're telling grander stories, more complex, more time-consuming stories in this, and so you have to be engaged as a player. It's also a game that kind of lends itself to having multiple people involved deeply in the story, in the overall game. The role of game master and player is a little fuzzier than in some games. For example, frankly, again, the system is so complex, I'm not going to be able to keep it all in my head. Preferably, I would have at least one other player, if not 2 or 3 other players, who have the rule books, who sit there and they read through the rules and they've got a good handle on at least part of it. So say you go and you're going to the fairy realm. You're dealing with the Seelie and the Unseelie court, and you really want to get into the weirdness of the fairies, which is great because they're chaotic and weird. They're not the Victorian, they're not Tinkerbell. They're not that Victorian concept of the fairy, the little girl with the wings. Fairies are really dark and weird and strange and alien, and they're fantastically fun and creative to mess around with. But maybe you've got one of the players in your group, they're really into this, and they focus on the fairy stuff. So if the group decides to go to the fairy realm, maybe that person takes over and runs it for a little while, or they work with the core game master to deal with any of the rules stuff that comes up, or maybe the two get together and figure out what kind of story they want to tell in there and work together to tell that. The same goes for the church. If you get involved with the divine in it, maybe somebody else wants to handle everything dealing with the divine or dealing with cities. If you want to go to cities, that's a whole other ballgame. Wizards and cities don't tend to mix very well. So it's a game that really kind of meshes the roles together a little bit. And I've said in the past that a player in Ars Magica almost has to work at the level a game master for any other game would work. And a game master has to work just that much more. That said, that work is worth it if you get out what you put in. There's other ways that I think you can get into this game. There's you can do lab notebooks where you write. You keep in a journal what your character is doing in their quiet time, and as a magi off in their lair doing their business, you write a lab journal, and you could tell a whole story, just you and your game master, through your journal. I did that in a game that I played. I had a whole subplot that barely ever even touched on a game session with everybody else. It was a whole subplot that was all done in my lab journal. It was great. It was so much fun. But again, you get out what you put in. If you're not going to put in the effort and the time, you're not going to get anything out of it. So again, with Ars Magica, there's a lot to go over. I know I've already talked quite a bit. I highly recommend this if you are if you're into the Middle Ages, if you're into the idea of magic. And this is not D&D, and I don't mean that in a disparaging way for D&D. It's just not that kind of a game. It's not about a warrior, thief, whatever, going off and fighting monsters. It's about wizards building power and creating new magic effects, and there's something called the Order of Hermes in here. I'm sorry, that's the Houses of Hermes, the Order of Hermes. There's something called the Hermetic magic theory. It's this whole concept that was put together that allowed these different houses to work together. And one of the things I love is that even in the book, they talk about that theory, Hermetic theory, isn't perfect. And it might be flawed in many ways. And part of what you could be doing as a wizard is finding those flaws, finding out how to exploit them, or finding out what piece is wrong, and you find the real truth behind it, and maybe you expand hermetic theory in some way. It's stuff like that. It's not just going out and killing monsters. There might be a little bit of that, but that's not what it's all about. Anyhow, I recommend this game to the... I don't know, if you think you might like it, look into it. I guess I'll put it that way, because it's not going to be to everybody's taste. It really isn't. It's my dream game. It's a game I want to run again someday, hopefully with somebody who will help me out dealing with some of the rules and things. But it's a challenging game, but I think it's well worth the effort. So I also had this book here to remind me that I think that Ars Magica could be a really interesting game if you wanted to boost the timeline forward about 1,000 years, and you could actually run a Harry Potter game with it. Now, the first few books of Harry Potter, when I was first reading these, my mom had recommended them to me, and I read the first couple, and all I kept thinking is, if you dropped a little bit of the humor out, this is like the future of Ars Magica. I would not have been surprised if somebody had told me at that point that J.K. Rowling had been a fan of the game. So I think that would be an interesting experiment to do with this. I'm not a Harry Potter aficionado, so I'm not the person to do it, but I think it would be an interesting experiment. I'd love to hear if somebody tried that. So I've said a lot, and maybe I've said a little about Ars Magica, but this is a game that's really near and dear to my heart, in spite of having only played it for a relatively brief amount of time. I have, as you can see, many of the books. There's actually a whole pile of books I'd really like to get. Most of the 5th edition. It's just a little pricier than I've been able to manage to talk myself into. I think it's definitely a game worth tracking down and playing if it seems like it's the kind of thing that you might be into. Yeah, it's really tough. It is, but in a good way. And there's definitely games out there that are more complicated and more difficult and not as rewarding. So check it out. Now, as I say in all of my videos, I want to remind you that I am an independent author, and you can check out in the links below, you can check out some of my stories to read, or check out my blog. And you can always check out my Patreon. Believe me, I would not mind. Where I'm currently working on a serialized story in a setting that I have written several stories in. So check those out if you would. Always, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Have you played Ars Magica? Does it sound interesting? Do you have questions? I feel like I didn't necessarily get as detailed as I should, even though I talked for a long time. But if you have questions, please, ask them. And what are some of your favorite games? What are some of your favorite games that are maybe a little more out there, a little more challenging than people are maybe used to? All right, well, on the next video.